In the final days before his family disappeared, one detail stood out to investigators. Christian Longo had been writing checks. Not small ones, but large amounts. Money he didn't have. Money tied to accounts that were already under scrutiny. And at the same time, he was telling people something very different. He said he had a new job. He said things were improving. He said everything was under control. But none of it was true. The records showed mounting debt, forged checks, accounts that didn't match his story. And then, suddenly, his entire family was gone. No goodbye, no explanation, just silence. This is what we know. Christian Longo was born in 1974. He was raised in a strict household connected to the Jehovah's Witnesses. Structure mattered, image mattered, appearances were important. As an adult, he carried that same pattern forward. He married Mary Jane Baker, and they built what looked like a stable life. 3 children followed: Sadie, Madison, Zachary. To neighbors and acquaintances, they appeared like any other young family. But behind that image, the pressure had already started to build. Longo struggled to maintain steady employment. He moved between jobs. And when income didn't match the lifestyle he wanted to project, he began to fill the gap another way. Forgery, false claims, borrowing money under false pretenses. It wasn't a single event, it was a pattern. He wrote bad checks, he lied about job offers. He convinced people he had opportunities that didn't exist. And for a time, it worked. He stayed ahead of consequences by moving frequently. New locations meant new impressions. New people meant fewer questions. But the pattern didn't stop. It escalated. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the financial situation had become serious. Debts were growing, creditors were closing in, and the lies were becoming harder to maintain. At the same time, his personal life was under strain. He had been excommunicated from his religious community. That separation carried weight. It affected his social circle, his identity, his support system, and it placed additional pressure on his marriage. Mary Jane remained with him, but the stability they once projected was starting to fracture. They moved again, eventually settling in Toledo, Oregon, a small coastal community, quiet and isolated. For Longo, it offered something familiar, a chance to start over, but the underlying issues came with him. He was still unemployed, still facing debt, still writing checks that would not clear. And by late 2001, the situation was reaching a breaking point. Bills were overdue, legal consequences were becoming unavoidable. There were indications that exposure was close, and yet, outwardly, he continued to present a different story. He maintained the image, even as it collapsed. Then came December 2001. The exact sequence of what happened inside the home was not witnessed. No one saw the moment things changed. But investigators would later reconstruct the timeline using forensic evidence. What they found pointed to a controlled, deliberate progression. Mary Jane was likely the first. Evidence indicated she had been strangled. There were no signs of a struggle that extended beyond the immediate act. No indication that neighbors heard anything unusual. After that, the children. Zachary, the youngest, was also strangled. The 2 daughters, Sadie and Madison. Their deaths involved a different method, but the result was the same. By the time it was over, the entire family was gone. Inside the home, there were no signs of forced entry, no indication of an outside intruder. Everything pointed inward. And then came the next phase. What happened after the killings? Investigators would later determine that Longo attempted to delay discovery. He used suitcases, containers, weighting them down, transporting them away from the home toward the coast, Yaquina Bay, a location that at first might have seemed remote enough, deep enough, unlikely to return what was placed there. But the ocean doesn't always cooperate with intention. And while this was happening, Longo was already preparing something else, an exit. Because when the bodies would eventually be discovered, he planned to be gone. There was no attempt to report his family missing, no calls to authorities, no visible search. Instead, there were movements that suggested preparation. He gathered what he needed: identification, money, anything that could support distance. And then he disappeared. Days passed. At first, the absence wasn't immediately recognized as a crime. Families move, people leave. But small details began to raise questions: unanswered calls, unreturned messages. And then, something else. On December 19, 2001, a discovery was made near the Oregon coast: a floating court case. Inside, the remains of a child. The scene was contained quickly. Authorities began their work. Identification would take time, but almost immediately, one fact became clear: this was not an isolated incident. Because just days later, another discovery was made, then another. Each one connected, each one pointing to the same conclusion: multiple victims disposed of in similar ways. The investigation intensified, and as details emerged, one name surfaced quickly: Christian Longo, the husband, the father, now missing. But there was something else, something that didn't fit cleanly into the timeline. Because while the bodies were being recovered in Oregon, there were indications that Longo had already left the country, and not under his own name, which raised a question investigators couldn't ignore. How far had he gone before anyone realized what had happened? As investigators worked along the Oregon coast, the pattern became undeniable. The suitcases were not random. Each one had been deliberately prepared. Each one contained part of the same story. The remains were identified as Longo's children: Sadie, Madison, Zachary. Days later, Mary Jane's body was also recovered. She had been weighted down differently, but the method pointed to the same person, the same intent. Inside the police reports, certain details stood out: the bindings, the placement, the effort taken to conceal. This was not impulsive. It required time, it required planning, and it raised a question that would follow the case from that point forward. When exactly did Longo decide this? Because the timeline didn't begin with the murders, it began weeks earlier. Financial records showed activity leading right up to December: bad checks, false claims, transactions that didn't align with his actual situation. He had attempted to purchase a van. He had tried to secure funds he didn't have. There were signs he knew something was coming: exposure, legal consequences, collapse. And then there was the disappearance itself. There was no missing persons report filed by him, no effort to suggest concern, no indication that he wanted anyone to look for his family. Instead, his actions suggested distance, movement, avoidance. Authorities issued an alert. Christian Longo was now the primary suspect in a multiple homicide investigation. His name entered national systems. Law enforcement began tracking his known associations, but almost immediately they hit a wall, because he had already moved beyond their immediate reach. Evidence showed he had traveled south using stolen identification. He crossed into Mexico. From there, the trail became harder to follow. Different names, different documents, the same pattern he had used before, just on a larger scale. But one detail made this case different: the number of victims, the nature of the crime. It wasn't a financial fraud anymore, it was a family annihilation, and that meant the search wouldn't remain local. It expanded quickly. Federal authorities became involved, and then media. The case began to spread across the country. Images of the victims, images of Longo. Details of the discoveries along the coast. The public started to recognize the name. But at that point, Longo was no longer in Mexico. Records later showed he had traveled to France, a decision that raised another question. Why choose a location that would draw attention? Because once there, he didn't attempt to disappear in the traditional sense. He didn't isolate himself. He didn't avoid public spaces. Instead, he inserted himself into them. Tourist areas, hostels, social environments. And then the name he chose. Michael Schumacher, a globally recognized figure, a Formula One champion. It wasn't a low-profile alias, it was the opposite. And yet, he used it repeatedly, introducing himself to strangers under that identity, signing documents, blending confidence with deception. For a time, it worked. He moved through parts of Europe without immediate detection. He spoke with other travelers, shared meals, created short-term connections, and no one, at first, recognized him for who he was. Back in the United States, the investigation continued. Forensic teams worked to solidify timelines. Evidence was catalogued, each piece reinforcing the same conclusion. There was no indication anyone else had been involved. No unknown DNA, no forced entry. The crime pointed back to Longo at every turn. But one aspect of the case complicated things: his absence. Without him, the narrative remained incomplete. There were still unanswered questions: the sequence of events inside the home, the exact timing, his reasoning. And the longer he remained missing, the more those questions lingered. Then, the case reached a turning point. It was featured on America's Most Wanted. Fugitives highlighted there were often captured, not through surveillance, but through recognition. Viewers, tips, someone seeing a face they couldn't forget. Longo's image was broadcast. Details of the case were shared. The victims, the timeline, the suspected movements. And then, across the Atlantic, something shifted. In France, individuals who had encountered him began to notice the resemblance. The name they had been told didn't match what they were now seeing. The face did. Reports were made, authorities were notified. And in January 2002, just weeks after the murders, French police located him in Nice. He wasn't hiding in isolation, he was in a public space, calm, unarmed. When officers approached, he did not resist. But he did something else. He maintained the lie. He identified himself as Michael Schumacher. Even in that moment, even as the evidence against him was closing in, it didn't hold. Authorities confirmed his identity: Christian Longo, wanted in the United States for the murder of his wife and 3 children. The international manhunt was over, but the case itself was far from finished. Because now came the next phase: interrogation, extradition, trial. And the question that had been building since the beginning: what explanation would he give once he could no longer run? And before that process unfolded, there's a moment here, a pause in the timeline. Cases like this travel far. People follow them from different parts of the world at different times. If you're here, watching from somewhere, it's always interesting to know where these stories reach. You can share that quietly in the comments and subscribe. Then the case moves forward again, because once Longo was in custody, the investigation entered its most revealing stage. And what he would say next would not stay consistent. Christian Longo was taken into custody in Nice. There was no struggle, no attempt to flee. But even then, his story did not align with the evidence. At first, he held on to the false identity, Michael Schumacher. It didn't last. Authorities confirmed who he was: the man wanted in the United States, the man connected to 4 murders. From there, the process moved quickly. He was detained, then prepared for extradition. Back across the Atlantic, back to Oregon, where the investigation had already built a case around him. When he arrived in the United States, the focus shifted, no longer on finding him, now on understanding what happened inside that home, and proving it in court. During initial proceedings, Longo pleaded not guilty. It was a critical moment because it signaled something important. He was not accepting responsibility. And soon after, he introduced a version of events that would define the early phase of the trial. He claimed Mary Jane had killed the children. He said he discovered it, and in a reaction, he killed her. That was the narrative he presented, but almost immediately there were problems, because the forensic evidence did not support it. The timeline didn't align. The method of death for each victim raised contradictions. Mary Jane had been strangled, so had Zachary, but the two daughters had been disposed of differently, weighted down, thrown into the water. The sequence suggested control, not a sudden reaction, not a single moment of rage. Investigators had already reconstructed the likely order. Mary Jane first, then the children, one after the other. There was also the issue of what happened after, the transport of the bodies, the preparation of containers, the trip to Yaquina Bay. These were not actions taken in panic. They required time, planning, movement without interruption. And then, the escape. Crossing into Mexico, traveling to Europe, assuming a false identity. Each step extended the timeline. Each step distanced him from the crime. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors focused on that pattern. They laid out the evidence piece by piece: financial records, forensic findings, travel movements. They presented a narrative built not on speculation, but on sequence, cause and effect, what happened and what followed. The defense approached it differently. They acknowledged parts of the evidence, but they attempted to reframe intent. They introduced arguments around psychological pressure, stress, desperation, the collapse of Longo's life. But even within that framework, the central issue remained: the actions themselves, because the evidence showed not just what happened, but how it happened, and how it was handled afterward. At one point in the proceedings, a detail from the investigation was revisited, a line from a report. It described the condition of one of the containers recovered from the water: secured, weighted, closed in a way that suggested preparation. It wasn't an afterthought, it was part of a process. And that process became central to the prosecution's argument. This was not loss of control, it was control, sustained from beginning to end. There was also the question of motive. Why would someone do this? The prosecution pointed to financial collapse, exposure, a pattern of deception that had reached its limit. They argued that Longo chose to eliminate the people closest to him rather than face consequences. The defense did not fully dispute the financial issues, but they attempted to separate those problems from the murders, to suggest something less calculated, but the timeline resisted that interpretation, because every step after the deaths reinforced intent. Leaving the home, disposing of evidence, fleeing the country, assuming a new identity. None of it suggested confusion, it suggested direction. As the trial continued, attention also turned to Longo's behavior before the murders. Witnesses described inconsistencies, statements that didn't match reality, claims of employment that couldn't be verified. A life built on appearance, maintained even when the foundation had already collapsed. And then there was the moment of confrontation inside the courtroom. Not a dramatic outburst, not a visible reaction, but the weight of the evidence itself. Because piece by piece, it closed the gaps. The version of events Longo had offered began to lose ground, and as that happened, the case moved toward its conclusion. But before the verdict, there was a moment that carried a different kind of weight. Not in the courtroom, but in the broader context of cases like this. Because stories like this often become headlines. But the full timeline holds more than that. The reason these cases are broken down in detail is so the sequence is clear. So what actually happened is understood, not just summarized. And then the focus returns to the courtroom. Because the jury now had everything in front of them: the evidence, the contradictions, the explanations, and the gaps that remained. They deliberated, reviewed the sequence, examined the consistency of the narrative, and when they returned, the decision was clear. Christian Longo was found guilty, multiple counts of aggravated murder, each count tied to a member of his family, each count supported by the evidence presented. But even then, the case was not finished, because one phase remained: sentencing. And the question that followed was not about guilt anymore. it was about consequence. What would the system decide after everything that had been established? The verdict had been delivered, guilty on multiple counts of aggravated murder. But the case had not reached its end. One phase remained, sentencing. And in a case involving 4 victims, the outcome carried a different weight. The courtroom shifted. The focus was no longer on what happened. That had been established. Now it was about consequence. What should be done with the man responsible? The prosecution presented its position clearly. They emphasized the pattern, the sequence, the control shown throughout. They revisited the timeline: Mary Jane, then the children, the preparation that followed, the transport, the disposal, the flight from the country. Each step reinforcing the same point: this was deliberate, calculated. They argued that the severity of the crimes, combined with the effort to evade responsibility, justified the highest penalty available under Oregon law. The defense took a different approach. They did not challenge the verdict directly. Instead, they shifted to Longo himself, his background, his upbringing, the pressure he had been under. They introduced arguments about mental and emotional strain, about a life built on expectations he could not meet. But even within those arguments, the central facts remained unchanged. 4 people had been killed, all within the same family, all by the same person. And after it was done, there had been no attempt to seek help, only distance, only escape. The jury considered both sides. They reviewed what had already been proven. They weighed the arguments presented during sentencing, and then they reached their decision. Christian Longo was sentenced to death. He was placed on death row at the Oregon State Penitentiary. The legal process, in its primary form, was complete. But the story did not end there, because in the years that followed, something shifted. Longo's account of what happened began to change. The version he had presented during trial, the one that blamed Mary Jane, was no longer maintained. He abandoned it. He admitted responsibility, full responsibility, for all 4 murders. The shift raised its own questions. Why change the story after conviction? Why move from denial to admission? In interviews conducted later, Longo described his actions as driven by desperation. He pointed to the collapse of his financial life, the exposure of his fraud, the loss of his standing in his community. He described a situation he felt he could not escape. But even within those explanations, there was a gap, because the reasoning did not change the sequence. It did not alter what had been done, and it did not answer the central question that remained. How does someone move from deception to this? The case drew attention beyond the courtroom, not just for the crimes, but for what followed. While on the run, Longo had interacted with people using false identities. At one point, he had even impersonated journalists. That connection led to correspondence after his arrest, a series of exchanges that explored his narrative, his thinking, and the way he presented himself. Those interactions later became the basis for the book and film. The project focused less on the crime itself and more on identity, on truth, on the ability to construct a version of reality that others might believe. But even in that retelling, the facts of the case did not change. 4 victims, a controlled sequence, an attempted escape, and a capture that ended it. Beyond media coverage, the case became part of a larger discussion. Family annihilation, a category of crime with its own patterns, often involving financial pressure. Isolation, a collapse of identity. In Longo's case, those elements were present. Chronic dishonesty, mounting debt, loss of community ties, and a refusal to confront consequences. Each factor building over time, each one unaddressed, until the outcome became irreversible. For the victim's extended family, the impact remained. Loss that could not be reversed, questions that could not be fully answered, and a timeline that would always end the same way. The investigation had established what happened. The trial had confirmed responsibility. The sentence had defined consequence. But understanding motive in cases like this often remains incomplete, because even when explanations are offered, they do not align cleanly with the actions. Today, Christian Longo remains on death row. His case continues to be referenced in discussions about criminal behavior and psychological patterns. It is studied, revisited, analyzed, but at its core, the facts remain unchanged. A man built a life on appearances, maintained it through deception, and when that structure collapsed, he chose not to face it. He chose to remove it entirely. There is no ambiguity in the outcome, no unresolved question about who was responsible, only the sequence, what happened and what followed. Cases like this often fade from public attention over time, but the details remain documented, structured, and clear. Because in the end, the story does not rely on interpretation, it rests on evidence. And the evidence shows a pattern that moved in one direction, step by step, until there was nothing left to sustain. 4 lives ended, 1 decision carried through, and a final consequence that remains in place.